Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here. Joining me today are the co-chairs of the Maryland Redistricting Reform Commission, Judge Alexander Williams, who was appointed by President Clinton and who served with great distinction on the U.S. District Court in Maryland until he decided to retire in 2014. Then we put him to work. And Walter Olson, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Constitutional Studies. We have four more commission members standing up here with us. Tessa Hill-Aston, who's the president of the Baltimore City branch of the NAACP. Here we have Allegheny County Delegate Jason Buckel, State Senator Steve Waugh, who represents Calvert and St. Mary's counties, and Ashley Oleson from the League of Women Voters. I think she's hiding back here. Also with us is Jennifer Bevan-Dangel, the Executive Director of Common Cause, Maryland. And finally, I want to recognize all of the members of the Redistricting Reform Commission who have joined us this morning, along with all of our legislators who are here. And on behalf of all Marylanders, I want to thank the commission members for all of their incredible work. They traveled all across the state, holding hearings and listening to people all across Maryland. And they reached a common sense, bipartisan consensus on this important issue of nonpartisan redistricting. In today's political climate, it can often seem rare or nearly impossible to find something that nearly everyone, everywhere, on both sides of the political spectrum can agree on. Nonpartisan redistricting reform and protecting the most fundamental American right to free and fair elections is one of those rare issues. When former Governor Martin O'Malley, the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post editorial boards, the League of Women Voters, and Common Cause can join together with us, along with an overwhelming majority of all Marylanders, then I believe the time for action is now. Something must be done to end the practice of highly partisan, unfair gerrymandering, and Maryland simply must lead the way. For far too long, this practice has stifled fairness, competition, and an open and honest debate of the issues. We haven't had balance or fairness or competitiveness in Maryland for decades. In fact, we have been singled out for having some of the worst, most gerrymandered and unfair districts in America. It seems hard to believe now, but it wasn't that long ago when Maryland was represented by 4 members of Congress from each party, a perfect balance. Now our state's representation is dominated by one party 7-1. And frankly, the outcome of the last several redistricting cycles have been downright disgraceful and an embarrassment to our state. Maryland's 3rd district, which has been likened to a broken-winged pterodactyl or a blood spatter from a crime scene, others have called it a Rorschach test. The 3rd district in Maryland has the distinction of being the worst, most gerrymandered, most unfair district in America. And the citizens of the 3rd district and the people of Maryland deserve better. In places like White Marsh and Owings Mills and Towson in Baltimore County, towns are cut up into 2 or 3 different pieces just to keep an effort to keep one party in control. And the current district maps are quite simply absurd and disgraceful. Of course, Maryland is not the only offender, and no party has a monopoly on this bad practice. I mean, there are states all across the country, no matter which political party has the majority, that are just as guilty of the exact same type of shameful gerrymandering. Some have suggested that redistricting reform should only be taken up at the national level and only after we have the entire nation agreeing. That's another way of saying we don't want it to happen, because it's not going to happen that way. I proudly and fully support redistricting at every level, nonpartisan redistricting reforms. However, just because others do not have the political will or the courage to do the right thing, that should not deter us from doing the right thing right here in Maryland. Because taking action right now, right here, to address this problem is the right thing to do. Last year, our administration introduced a similar common sense proposal, which would set an example for the nation by finally making elections in the free state of Maryland free and fair elections. Sadly, this important reform legislation was hidden in a drawer, never to see the light of day, never even brought to the floor for a vote. This year, our administration again renewed our calls for these important reforms by introducing the Redistricting Reform Act of 2017, which will once and for all remove the politics and the politicians from the process. This legislation provides for a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and it will create a fair, nonpartisan, open, and transparent redistricting process. Nearly all Marylanders, regardless of their party, support this legislation because they want to have a system in place that encourages a diversity of opinion, allows for checks and balances, and ensures that our elections are fair and competitive so the voters can actually pick their representatives rather than the other way around. We're pleased, very pleased, that there seems to be finally real momentum behind this bill. This afternoon, committees in both the House and the Senate are holding hearings on the Redistricting Reform Act of 2017. Most Marylanders of all parties favor an independent, nonpartisan redistricting process. And at the very least that these Marylanders deserve is to have this bill finally come to the floor of both houses for an up or down vote. This isn't a fight between the right and the left. This is a fight between right and wrong. This is about recognizing a problem and choosing to do the right thing, to solve it in a common sense, bipartisan way, because the status quo is no longer good enough. We have an opportunity right now to take action right here in Maryland. There are only 39 days left in this legislative session. Redistricting reform was one important part of our administration's comprehensive integrity in government initiative, which includes a number of reforms to restore the public's trust in our state government and to finally bring some transparency, accountability, and fairness to Annapolis. These are common sense pieces of legislation that could have a dramatic and positive impact on our continuing efforts to clean up the political system here in Maryland. And I urge our legislators on both sides of the aisle to come together and to act now on the Public Integrity Act, to act now on the Legislative Transparency Act, and to act now on this very important Redistricting Reform Act of 2017. Let's all work together to get this done. And thank you all for being here again. I want to turn the mic over at this time to Judge Alexander Williams, the chairman of the commission, for some brief remarks. Thank you, Judge.
I want to thank the governor for appointing me. It's a real privilege to have served on that board. We had a very balanced, bipartisan group, and we held hearings all across Maryland, in the Eastern Shore, and Western Maryland, Southern Maryland, and then the Baltimore, Washington communities. And what I discovered from participating in those hearings is that the overwhelming view of most of the residents who testified, who showed up, is that this thing has to be fixed. Again, they were concerned about the splitting of not just communities, but even cities and towns. And the recommendation that kept coming up all across Maryland was that they needed to have some type of independent commission look at the drawing of the lines. I want to echo something that the governor has said. This is a national problem. As some of you know, I sat on a 3-judge panel in Greenbelt, Maryland, the federal court before I left, which challenged the plan that was submitted. And the two issues that we dealt with at that time, one was that there need to be included the prison population, and then the argument was that there ought to be 3 African Americans or minority districts instead of 2. And those were the arguments that were raised. We ultimately upheld the plan, but it went to the Supreme Court with some very interesting issues. Also want to tell you, as you all know, there's a big case in Maryland now, Shapiro versus McManus, which a couple of weeks ago the Supreme Court sent back and suggested that the novel theory of First Amendment, freedom of expression and association, has to be dealt with by Maryland. This issue, folks, is not going away. It's a litigious mess, and enormous litigations are continuing to come. I support what the governor's trying to do, and what our commission recommended in our report of last year is that an independent commission be put together to address this very, very serious issue. And I tell you, if it isn't done, what's going to happen is that the courts, the Supreme Court or the lower courts, are going to end up drawing the lines here in Maryland. That's not what we want. The courts are not familiar with what we need to do. We need to keep this ourselves. And I've heard a lot of calls for waiting until Congress fixes it, but Maryland has always been the leader in the great issues of education and transportation and environmental concerns and in criminal justice. And so in my view, Maryland should tackle this tough problem, wrestle with it, and get it done. I support the governor 100% on his request for this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Williams. And now I'd like to turn the podium over to Jennifer Bevan-Dangel from Common Cause, Maryland. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Governor. Good morning. Good morning. This is certainly an exciting moment for Common Cause Maryland, the League of Women Voters, and the other partners of our Tame the Gerrymander coalition. We have been working tirelessly to be the voice of the public, the voice of that 73% that year after year says in that Goucher poll they want to see a new process for drawing our state and congressional district lines. We have run around Congressional District 3. We have held birthday parties commemorating Elbridge Gerry, the namesake of the gerrymander. We've even dressed my children up in pterodactyl outfits until those outfits barely fit them anymore. It's very sad. And my children are too old to want to any longer, come out with a silly hat on in public. But we are seeing through all of that work, through all of the groundwork done by the governor's leadership, the commission's hard work, the public hearings, a real shift, a seismic shift, we believe, in the momentum behind redistricting reform. For the first time ever, we have a serious call at the federal level, our congressional delegation helping lead the way to make sure that as Maryland acts, we do not act alone. We have a very different feel coming from our courts, including the Supreme Court, including Maryland's courts, who are taking a very hard look at the contoured and tortured districts that are being drawn here in Maryland, but from coast to coast, from North Carolina to Wisconsin. The courts are striking down these gerrymanders and going beyond some of the traditional legal theory into new legal arguments that could end up, as the judge said, changing the framework that we're operating under. And of course, we're seeing a renewed momentum, a renewed reform here in Maryland from the governor, from the commission, from the suite of delegates and senators here, many of whom have put in bills before, and senators and delegates who have put in bills for the first time this year. It's almost as if this perfect storm has hit the state, and finally people are saying, let's seriously tackle this issue. So on behalf of the 73% of Marylanders, on the behalf of the 3,000 members and activists that the League and Common Cause have seen take action on this issue in the last year, and on behalf of all the Marylanders who clearly want a more fair, and equitable process for drawing these lines. We urge the legislature to make some progress. Let this be the year that my children can pack up those pterodactyl outfits and never have to wear them again. Let's make some real progress on redistricting reform.